Hey South Hills, today I want to introduce my friend Allie. Her and her husband David many years ago came across South Hills Burbank and walked in through our doors and really fell in love with our church, and they started volunteering. Sure enough, her talent got sought out and she became a staff member for our South Hills Burbank campus. Recently, God called her to make a difference in women's life who've graduated from the foster system. So she's going to tell us a little bit about this story.
So Jacaranda Housing is a 2-year housing program for young women ages 18 to 22 who are aging out of the foster system or who are struggling with homelessness. About 10 years ago, I was working in Skid Row and seeing the young adults that were living in that area really just broke my heart. And 5 years ago, I was having a really hard time with my self-worth, and so I decided to walk around my neighborhood. What I found was these beautiful jacaranda trees were in full bloom. These trees weren't perfect. They were all kind of twisted, and God was like, Allie, see, there's beauty in imperfection, which is why I came up with Jacaranda Housing. A few years later, the pandemic hit. Everything got shut down, and God was like, Allie, I'm giving you time. So I just asked a few people to be on my board, and we put together an amazing program. We have some really beautiful partnerships with other local organizations. When Los Angeles Housing did a homeless count, they found that there were over 4,600 transition-age youth living on the streets, and they end up being trafficked. They end up getting arrested. They end up in trouble with the law. And the most important thing is having someone there to really step in where they're at and love on them where they are.
I am so proud of you. I know you and I have talked a lot about this. You stepped out in faith. And so today, anything that we give towards Above and Beyond at all of our campuses is going to be dedicated towards funding Jacaranda Housing. So I want to encourage you to ask God, how can you step out and support in this movement so that Allie and her team, Jacaranda Housing, can continue to minister to the women who are graduating from the foster system.
This conversation that we're kicking off I've been both anticipating it and kind of dreading it for the better part of 7 months, because on the one hand, I'm a part of the team that helps sort of plan and decide the kinds of stuff that we talk about on Sundays at all of our campuses. And so last fall, when we gathered to plan out this year, we really had this sense as we began to talk and pray and plan and strategize that this conversation was one that we just could not ignore. Now, on the other hand, talking about depression and anxiety and sort of mental health for several weeks, well, to be honest, it's a little bit overwhelming and a little bit depressing. And so, my personality is like joy and happiness and positivity and, everything. I am, the everything is awesome guy from the Lego movie. Like, that is the way I feel every single day of my life. It's not put on. I genuinely feel that. And so there's part of me that's just like, oh man, this is going to be like so hard it feels depressing, because I am naturally sort of drawn to the beauty and joy and hope in life. But I also know that life isn't all sunshine and rainbows. At least mine hasn't been that way. So the next few weeks, they may be a little bit heavier than usual at times around here as we dive head first, full force into this conversation. Now, I do have a confession up front, and that is that I know that this conversation is way bigger than we have time or space for in just a handful of sermons or talks that take place on a Sunday morning, but it's also way bigger than me. I'm not an expert in anything except my own journey and my own human experience. And so chances are, if you're somebody that struggles or has dealt with, or you love somebody or you're around somebody that deals with mental health stuff, chances are I'm probably going to fall short of addressing the issue that you feel like you just need to be addressed, or answering the question that you so desperately want answered. But I want you to know that even though I am inadequate, the scriptures are not, and God certainly is not. And so the goal for me in this series, in fact, is just to take a conversation, take something that's kind of been off limits really to talk about at church and to drag it into the light. So that every single person can know that no matter where they are or what they're battling, that nobody fights alone, that nobody stands alone. And so my goal is to hopefully start a conversation between you and God that will carry over to your whole life and begin to spill over into the people around you. And so I just want you to know right off the top, if you are one of those people that struggles with or battles anxiety and or depression, or you have days that you just are struggling to find even a single reason to live, I just want you to know that you are not alone. And what I want to invite you to do and what I want to ask you to do is just to summon all the courage and strength that maybe you have and to take this journey with us the next few weeks. If you are somebody who is not struggling with this has never been kind of a soft spot in your life, I do want to tell you that there's all kinds of great stuff for you in this conversation. Because the truth is even though you may not be struggling with it, somebody that is in your orbit, somebody you love, somebody you care about, somebody you work with, somebody you're raising, somebody who raised you, somebody you're related to, somebody is dealing with this around you, even if you don't know it. So 10 years ago, there was an organization called Invisible Children that was founded by a guy named Jason Russell, and they put out a video, and that video was about the abuse and kidnapping and killing of children in the country of Uganda. And the video was called, it kicked off a campaign, it was called Kony 2012. Anybody remember Kony 2012? Okay, a few of us, okay. So it was a 30-minute kind of documentary, and it was one of the very first viral campaigns that ever happened on the internet. And it just blew up. It took off. And it was viewed over 1 million times within the first 12 to 14 hours that it was out just alone. And it just exploded. And then the internet did what the internet does, right? So with all that attention came this massive backlash and a ton of scrutiny and hate, because that's what the internet does. And so within a few weeks, the founder of Invisible Children, his name is Jason Russell, as I said a second ago, he had just a complete and total breakdown. And he lived in San Diego one day. He just ripped off his clothes in the middle of his street and began to run down the street and was cursing and yelling at people and screaming obscenities at people and slamming into cars and just absolutely lost his mind. He ended up hospitalized in a mental health facility for over 2 months. And most of the time when situations like that happen to somebody that we don't know, we're usually far enough away where it's just kind of like, it's sad and it's kind of interesting. It's more just kind of like a train wreck, right? But they usually just end up being the latest meme or sort of punchline on social media. But still, if we're honest, there's something that's a little bit confusing about it. Right? Because we can't help but think, how did that happen? Like, how did they get to that point? What's going on with them? Like, I can't imagine, I can imagine getting a lot of hate on the internet, but it feels like that was just such an extreme sort of thing to happen because some people didn't like your video. Obviously, it all feels and lands a little bit differently when it's somebody that's closer to home, right? Like, you may not have known somebody who stripped naked in the streets, but most of us have actually witnessed someone we know and care about break down on a smaller scale, right? Like whether it's somebody that just out of the blue, just suddenly up and leaves their family and takes off and goes and starts a completely new life. Somebody that is hospitalized because they had a drinking problem that you never even realized that they had. Somebody that was admitted to a mental health facility and you didn't even know that they were struggling. It's all of these moments where there's this external evidence of all of the internal battles that these people are dealing with, that we deal with, right? And we can't see it, but something's been eating away at them on the inside. And now their very private battle has become a very public breakdown. They're demonstrating on the outside the kind of unrelenting pressure and pain and brokenness that they've been experiencing all along for who knows how long on the inside. And then suddenly their ability to sort of hold it all in and hold it all together breaks. See, oftentimes we actually don't realize how depressed somebody is until they do have a breakdown. And sometimes we don't even realize how depressed we are until we have a breakdown. Because the truth is, we're all pretty good at kind of hiding our darkest and most manic moments from other people, and sometimes even from ourselves. Most people suffering with depression are pretty good at creating a front that looks really good, just out of survival. They're convinced that if other people really knew what was happening inside of them, that they'd reject them. And as much as we'd like to spend our time trying to convince them that that's not true, the reality is sometimes it actually is true. And so what do we do as human beings? We do whatever we have to do to push it all to the side and just kind of continue to function and continue to do the things we have to do and not draw attention to ourselves and not inconvenience other people and just sort of bear up under it as best we can. All the while, we're just kind of quietly dying on the inside. And maybe most disturbingly and tragically of all of this for me is that it's in spaces like this, right? It's in the arena of faith that this seems to happen all too frequently, or at least as frequently as it happens other places, where people don't feel permission to be honest about their real struggles. Like even the language that we use in church most of the time, sometimes it's just almost magical, right? Like where we say to people things like, all you need to do is just pray more, or read the Bible more, or trust God more. Or you know what your problem is? You just don't have enough faith. And obviously not only is not helpful, it's harmful. But it's not just what other people think, though. That's not just the kind of thinking other people have, too. Like if you've been a follower of Jesus, have you ever thought, like, if I could just get this thing right, I wouldn't be anxious or discouraged again. I wouldn't really struggle with this. Like, if I could just get my relationship with Jesus right, I wouldn't be depressed anymore. I wouldn't struggle with this thing anymore. I wouldn't be down anymore. I wouldn't fight despair all the time. It's strange, but we act as if the people in the scriptures were somehow immune to these kinds of struggles, but they weren't. In fact, it's just the opposite, because the scriptures are full of stories of loneliness and despair and anxiety and depression. In fact, one of the things that you begin to notice over and over and over again as a common characteristic of the people that God uses in these beautiful ways is that they all have these incredible high moments of faith and heroism. But they also have these incredible low moments of darkness and despair. And sometimes they're right together, one right after the other. I mean, it's all over the place, but it's especially true. We see this a lot in the book of Psalms, because the Psalms are just a collection of poems and songs that were written, and they were written by people in all, experiencing all the highs and lows of life, right? I actually think there's probably some unwritten rule that anytime you talk about something that's kind of emotionally and spiritually heavy in church, you're required to read from the Psalms. And I'm not much on following rules, but I do feel compelled to kind of go there this morning. And so we are going to read from a Psalm in Psalm 88. Before we do, though, I do want to give you a little bit of background. So as I said a second ago, the Psalms are a collection of mostly poems and songs. And so typically there's a part of the psalm that we skip when we read the scriptures, especially if you've been a Bible person, and that is there's instructions. It tells you who wrote it and what they were thinking and what was going on. There's some instructions usually for a choir director or somebody like that, and you're just like, I don't need that. I'm not going to sing this. I don't know this tune. This isn't my jam, so we just kind of skip that part. But I want to include some of that this morning. So Psalm 88, it says this. It starts out, it says, for the choir director, a song to be sung to the tune of the suffering of affliction. Now, that part kind of makes me laugh, because they gathered for church at the tabernacle, at the temple, and they would gather together and they would sing. And they had a tune that everybody knew that they sang at church called the suffering of affliction. Apparently, it was like their graves into gardens, only it was a lot more graves than it was gardens. Like they would get together, like, you guys know that suffering affliction? Okay, kick it, guys. This is what we're going to sing this to. And then it says a psalm of Heman the Ezrahite. Pretty sure that's not how you pronounce his name, but I love that that's his name, and so that's what he's going to be today. He is Heman. All right, so this is what Heman the Ezrahite said in verse 1. He says, O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out to you by day. I come to you at night. Now hear my prayer and listen to my cry. For my life is full of troubles and death draws near. I am as good as dead, like a strong man with no strength left. They have left me among the dead, and I lie like a corpse in a grave. I am forgotten, cut off from your care. You have thrown me into the lowest pit, into the darkest depths. Your anger weighs me down, and with wave after wave, you have engulfed me. You have driven my friends away by making me repulsive to them. This is a worship song, guys, all right? So if you just want to lift your hands and close your eyes and enjoy the presence of the Lord as I read it, you can. He says, I am in a trap with no way of escape. My eyes are blinded by my tears. Each day I beg for your help, O Lord. I lift my hands to you for mercy. Are your wonderful deeds of any use to the dead? Do the dead rise up and praise you? Can those in the grave declare your unfailing love? Can they proclaim your faithfulness in the place of destruction? Can the darkness speak of your wonderful deeds? Can anyone in the land of forgetfulness talk about your righteousness? Oh Lord, I cry out to you, and I will keep pleading day by day. Oh Lord, why do you reject me? Why do you turn your face from me? I have been sick and close to death from my youth. I stand helpless and desperate before your terrors. Your fierce anger has overwhelmed me. Your terrors have paralyzed me. They swirl around me like floodwaters all day long. They have engulfed me completely. You have taken away my companions and loved ones. Darkness is my closest friend. That is the entire psalm. There is nothing more to it. See, despair and sadness and anguish, if you're familiar with the Psalms at all, they're not unique to the Psalms. But this one is unique in that in most of them, the difference is those things are a part of it, but eventually those things sort of give way to hope at some point. Those things sort of give way to the light at someone. The darkness sort of falls away and light takes over, but not this one. This one just keeps getting darker and darker and darker, and it ends with darkness is my closest, some translations say, my only friend. Now, it's not exactly what you'd expect from a guy named He-Man. Pretty sure their culture was more masculine than ours, right? And in our culture, guys, like, you're not going to write a song like that and people not go, man, come on, like, lighten up, bro. Right? But this is what instantly popped into my head. Is this image, is this guy that's strong and strapping. And yet, as depressing and tormented as this passage is, it's included in the Word of God. See, this is something that God actually wanted us to read and chew on and sit with. As I said a second ago, it was a song for them that when they gathered in the temple, that they would sing together. But why? Well, I think part of it is so that it would make it okay to not be okay. That it would create space for people to explore the tough and the brutal parts of life so that people could surface and confess and process through even their darkest moments with other people so that they could find a way forward together. When I was a kid, church was this weird mixture of always putting on a smile and kind of hiding the dark, sad, hopeless, hurtful thoughts. So there's that part of it. And then it was mixed with, like, the pastor kind of always sort of seemed to do his best to try to convince you how bad your life was so that you would try Jesus. And it just felt like this weird, like, I'm supposed to be like miserable, but I'm not supposed to show it. But it was different for the people of Israel. Yeah, the tabernacle was where you went to celebrate, but it was also where you went to mourn. It was where you went to dream for the future, but it was also where you went when you couldn't find a reason to live just another day. We don't actually know a lot about this guy, He-Man. In fact, he's kind of an obscure character in the Old Testament. What we do know from the scriptures, though, is that he was actually a pretty awesome guy. That King David chose him as one of his closest advisors, that he loved God, that he was known for his wisdom and his leadership, that he was a gifted musician and songwriter. In fact, when Solomon built the temple, that this guy was one of only 3 people that were chosen out of all of the million people in the nation of Israel that was chosen to serve in the temple full time to write and create music and write worship for the people as they came in to sing. We also know, though, that depression was not something that was new to him, that it was something that he seemed to battle most of his life with. See, here's the thing. Emptiness in our soul isn't proof of God's absence. So often we think because we feel empty inside and God feels distant that he's gone, he's not there, he's absent, but it's not proof of that. In fact, the only thing that depression and anxiety are proof of is that you are human. By the way, I think part of what makes this conversation so challenging for us is that depression actually doesn't look the same for everybody else. I mean, for everyone, right? Some people eat too much. That's not a symptom. That was just me making a statement. Some of y'all just eat too much. I'm just kidding. No, some people do eat too much. Some people stop eating altogether. Some people sleep constantly. Some have insomnia. Some can't get out of bed. Some people push themselves constantly with constant activity and noise and obsession. So what are we even talking about when we're talking about this stuff then? Right? I think we often think of depression as this deep and profound sadness and despair. And while that can be it for some people, it may start that way, but many times it isn't as much sadness as it is numbness, this long-term joylessness and hopelessness that just numbs out your whole life. Because the truth is, we all have depressing moments. We all have depressing feelings. We all have moments of sadness and despair and hopelessness and grief. But it's getting stuck in them is the problem, which is kind of obvious, right? And so why don't you just snap out of it? Why don't you just get going? Move forward. Don't be depressed. Right? And so we do our best to sort of avoid and deny these experiences, but I want you to listen to one of the most famous portions of Scripture that's found in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Beginning with verse 1. You probably know these words. It says, "For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under the sun, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance. There's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them up, a time to embrace and a time to turn away. There's a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak. There's a time to love and a time to hate. There's a time for war and a time for peace." I think the reason why we're drawn to these words, we often love how poetic these verses are. But when Solomon wrote these, he wasn't trying to write poetry. He was actually making a very practical observation about life, about the human experience, that it is full of both high moments and low moments, that it's full of wins and losses, it's full of beauty and tragedy, of darkness and light, and that there is a time for all of it, and that we should make time for all of it. Now, if you're like me, you just think, ain't nobody got time for that. Like, life's too busy. I got stuff I got to do. I got kids to take care of. I got responsibilities. Who's got time for all the mess of life? Just clean it up and move on. I mean, a time to die and tear down and cry and grieve and scatter and walk away and desperately search and throw away and sit in silence and hate and war. Like, no thanks. I'm good. Besides, I don't want to get bogged down and trapped by all of that. I don't want to get stuck in that stuff. I just want to rise above it. And therein lies this strange juxtaposition, that the more space and time that we allow in our lives to experience and process the hardest parts of life, the less likely we are to actually get stuck and trapped there. See, it's when we try to avoid and stuff them that actually causes us to get stuck in them. Because the truth is, nobody makes it through life unscathed. Life will call your number at some point. If it hasn't happened, buckle up, it will. But denying and avoiding, those things may work in the short term when we're going through those experiences, but it never ends well because it just ends up building up and building up and building up and boiling over in destructive ways until we have a breakdown. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. He said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." See, you may think that avoiding the feelings, that by avoiding them you can escape them, but the truth is that we know from the scriptures and we know from psychology, all the studies show that the more we suppress something, the stronger it gets. And so instead of feeling comforted, we start feeling crazy. We titled this series, Defeating Depression. And here's the truth. If this is something that you struggle with or somebody you love struggles with, you might defeat it. There aren't any quick fixes or magic bullets. There's no spiritual formula. There's no 5 steps to recovery. The truth is, I actually think I heard this comparison, and in my experience, it rang true, that anxiety and depression are actually a lot like heart disease. That there isn't one thing that causes it. It's a mix of things. Sometimes it's genetic. Sometimes it's emotional wiring. Sometimes it's the stress levels in our lives. Sometimes it's something that happened to us, this triggering moment. Sometimes it's our lifestyle and habits. Most of the time, it's all that stuff sort of mixed in together, right? But you don't actually catch it like an infection. You're just like, oh, I got too close to that depressed person. Now I'm depressed, right? You don't actually catch heart failure that way either. A heart attack, heart failure happens suddenly, but nobody has rapid onset heart disease. It develops slowly and gradually over time. And then one day you cross over an invisible threshold that you didn't even know that you crossed. And now you have it. And once you got it, you're going to deal with it for the rest of your life. Yesterday you were quote unquote normal, but today there's a brand new normal in your life. Today you're in a battle for your life that will last for the rest of your life. You actually have to learn how to get good at having heart disease. Meaning that you might not ever defeat it, right? Your heart might not ever return to pre-heart disease, but you can keep that heart disease from defeating you. And I think that is the same thing that's true in this conversation. See, God may do something supernaturally and he may heal you, and you may experience depression being completely defeated in your life, but he also may not. You may defeat your anxiety and depression, but you might not. But here's the good news. You might not defeat depression, but you can keep it from defeating you. You can get good at living with anxiety and stress and depression and despair. In fact, that's a huge part of our story, my wife and I. So to prevent a heart attack, you have to address and not just one of those underlying issues, but all of them. And it's the same with your soul. It's the same with your mental health. Don't wait for a breakdown to begin to address those things, though. Now, obviously, depression is enormously complex. It's biological, it's mental, it's emotional, relational, environmental, habitual, spiritual, it's situational. And chances are you're going to have to address more than one of those areas if you're struggling. And if you love somebody who's struggling, you're going to have to help them begin to tackle one or more of those areas in order for them to be able to begin to move forward. Which brings us to Jesus, because in John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus famously said that he came to show us how to live life to the full. How to live, how to truly and fully live, which is interesting. See, because the opposite of depression isn't just joy or happiness, it's actually vitality. It's being full of life, or life to the full. And so there, in a very real sense, battling depression is about learning the art of living well in every single area of your life. It's about emotional, physical, relational, spiritual, and yes, your mental health and vitality in all of those areas of your life. And that is exactly what Jesus came to show us. Now, the process of God mending your soul takes time, and sometimes it takes a good counselor, and sometimes it takes a good program, and sometimes it takes a good medication. Why? Because you're an integrated being. If you were just a spirit, then all you would need for God is for God to heal your spirit. But if the brain chemistry is off in your brain, God's going to have to heal that too, or you're going to have to get some medication that helps balance that out. Why? Because you're not just a spirit. You're not just a body. You're an integrated person. What I can tell you, though, is that peace and hope, they aren't things that you achieve once and then have for the rest of your life. They're actually battles you have to step into every single day of your life. And that process, that fight actually begins in an unlikely place. And that place is reflection. It's looking at what's really going on inside of you and being honest with yourself and being honest with people that are close to you and being honest with God. Because here's the deal, God won't force himself on you. So he will only help you fix and address what you're willing to face and admit. In fact, in Psalm 139, verse 23, King David wrote these words. He says, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." He's going, God, help me look at the messiness in my soul and in my life, at the ways that I'm acting out, both big and small, and help me dig below the surface of just the stuff that I'm doing and see what's underneath and see why I'm doing it. Help me see all the stuff that I'm trying to avoid feeling or facing. All of my anxious thoughts. That's what I love about what He-Man wrote, is he honored the story for everything that it was, right? He didn't try to suppress it or sanitize it because this is a song for church and so I got to clean it up and make it hopeful. He just put it all out there. And yeah, he was talking to God, but remember, he wrote a song for everyone, right? He wrote a song that everybody was going to be singing. Can you imagine, like in our culture, if somebody wrote a song like that, we'd be singing like, dude, are you okay? Should we stop and like check on this dude that just wrote this? Darkness is my only friend. Like, ooh, like I feel that in my soul. And so all month long, we are, to help us with this reflection piece, we are going to be giving these little journal prompts, these little questions at the end of the message. And so I encourage you to take a picture of the slide and begin to have this conversation, whether it's just you and your spouse, whether you're in a small group here at South Hills, whether it's some friends that you get together with, whether you just sit down, just you and your own thoughts and begin to think about it and pray about it and talk to God about it. But here they are. So what are the emotions, what emotions do you avoid because you see them as uncomfortable, unacceptable, or inappropriate? And then what do you do to keep yourself from having to fully feel them? Now, why would we do this? What good could come from this exercise? Because your story is sacred and you need to honor it. Because there's a time and a place and a space for the darkness and the brokenness and the messiness of life. And that's the good news, is that you're not too messy or broken for God or for us. David, who knew his own seasons of depression and despair, he made this observation about his experience in Psalm 34:18. He said, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he rescues those whose spirits are crushed." What an incredibly beautiful promise from God. Now, if you know this verse, we usually only talk about it in the context of grief and tragedy. But I also think it applies very much to this conversation, because I think we could actually read this verse that God is close to the anxious and the depressed, that he comes to the aid of the weary and the despairing. See, when you're broken to pieces and all the color and the beauty has been drained from life, when the breath has been knocked out of you and it feels like you're just suffocating and you can't seem to catch your breath in life, when the life has been sucked out of your soul, God is close. And the implication of what David's saying from his own experience is that God is never closer to us than he is in those moments. Even when you can't feel it, even when you can't see it, even when you don't know it, that he is near. Over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to share some pieces of my wife and our story, because she has had a long and protracted battle with mental health, depression stuff. And this conversation hits really close to home for us, because quite literally, medication saved her life. She was right in the throes of trying to find a reason to live. And so whether it's what journey we've been on, whether it's medication or a counselor or therapy, whatever, like I envision these things as scaffolding around our life that God brings to help us get stronger and make it through. And one of the most beautiful things about her and her story is that she honors the story. She's never suppressed it. She's never sanitized it. And can I tell you, as a pastor whose wife has been very open about her journey, I've heard all the comments. I've received all the feedback. People who are well-meaning. But I've always been like, babe, tell your story. Say it loud. Because on the back end, the people who don't comment to me, the people who don't comment on her post are droves and droves and droves of people saying, I read what you said, and I thought I was the only one. I read what you said, and I'm struggling to try to find a reason to live, and I'm so embarrassed because I'm a Christian. If you're struggling, I want you to know that you're not alone, that God is with you, and so are we, but you have to let God in. You have to let people close to you. We want to pray for you, and we want to come alongside you, but we also want to help you find and connect with other resources if those are the things that you need. God is near. God is here. You can let him in. Let's pray together.